everybody, today we are starting off Chapter 5 with Lesson 5.2, Add, Subtract, and Multiply Polynomials. Before we really get into the heart of this lesson though, I want to go over some vocabulary that we'll be using not just in this lesson, but for the entire 6 weeks. So our polynomial vocabulary, let's first define what a polynomial actually is. So a polynomial is an expression made up of one or more monomial terms. But that doesn't mean a whole lot if we don't know what a monomial is, so let's define that next. A monomial is a term that's made up of a number, and if it's just a number by itself, it's called a constant. It could be a variable, or it could be the product, the multiplication of a number and a variable, or even more than one variable, with or without an exponent. And if we have that product of a number and a variable, the number in that case is called a coefficient. So let's look at a typical term that is made up of a product of a number, a 5, a variable, and an exponent. Let's go ahead and talk about some restrictions on these terms in order for it to be considered a monomial. So this 5x squared is just an example, and in this example, the 5 is the coefficient. And the coefficient can be any real number. So as long as it doesn't have one of those imaginary units on it, it can be anything. So any real number. So it could be a fraction, a decimal, a negative, a positive, a square root even. It can be any real number that you can think of. Next is our x term, or our variable term more generically. And the variable can be any letter of the alphabet. Finally, the most restricted is our exponent. There are some pretty heavy restrictions on our exponent. It can only be a whole number. And so if you remember back to the very first lesson, in the very first 6 weeks, we talked about what a whole number was, and it's basically the counting numbers plus 0. So 0 and then 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So that means it doesn't include negative numbers, so no negatives. No fractions, no square roots, etc. All right, so pretty restricted there. It can only be a positive whole number. Because of that fact, that actually restricts a couple of things on our variable. Our variable can't be under a radical, because if it's under a radical, it's under a square root, remember that a square root is the same thing as a 1/2 exponent, and we already said no fractions. The other thing that it can't be is it can't be in the denominator or bottom of a fraction. It can be in the top of a fraction, but not in the bottom, because if it's in the bottom of a fraction, like a 1 over x, that's the same thing as x to the negative 1 power, and we already said no negatives. So because of the restrictions on the exponent, our variable gets restricted a little bit. Let's go ahead and continue talking about some more vocabulary terms. And the next term is degree. The degree, and I'm going to abbreviate that typically with just a capital D. And the degree is the largest exponent in the polynomial. Once we identify the degree, then we can talk about the leading coefficient. And the leading coefficient is going to be abbreviated with an LC whenever I write it, so I don't have to write it so many times. And that's the coefficient that's in front of the variable with the largest exponent. So once you identify the degree as the largest exponent, look at the front of that term and pick out your leading coefficient. So for example, on this particular problem, 5x squared minus 6x to the 4th plus 2x minus 5, this is our degree because it's our biggest exponent. So this is the degree, and we would write it as D is 4. Once we identify the degree, we just look to the front of that particular term to determine our leading coefficient, and it's a -6. So this is our leading coefficient. And LC for short is -6. Be sure that if there's a negative there that you bring it along. All right, the next term we want to talk about is standard form of a polynomial. And standard form means that it's written with the highest degree exponent first, that degreed term, and then you decrease your exponent going left to right. So in this example up here, we are not in standard form. This term would need to be moved to the front in order for us to be in standard form. Let's look at another example. If we had 7x to the 5th plus 5x squared plus 10x minus 3, that's in standard form. Notice that we don't have to have every single exponent. We jump from a 5 to a 2. There's no 4 or 3, but every term that we have needs to be in that decreasing exponent order. If we take this and just scramble a couple of the numbers, for example, if we started with the 5x squared and then said plus 7x to the 5th plus 10x minus 3, then this is a non-example. This is an example of not in standard form. So the reason that that's important is that every time that you give me an answer, whether it's on a homework, a quiz, or whatever, our answers are always going to be written in this form. Answers are always this form. Okay, it will be counted wrong if they're out of order. It's got to be in the correct order. All right, let's finally talk about types of polynomials. Some of the lower degreed polynomials have special names. And so the type, which I'll abbreviate with a T, can be a constant if we just simply have a number, like a 5, as our entire polynomial. If we have a linear, which you covered extensively in Algebra 1 and we touched on it in Algebra 2, that has a first degree because, for example here, this 2x, remember if you just see a variable, there is an implied 1. So that is a first degree polynomial. Quadratic is what we spent last 6 weeks talking about. We know that that contains an x squared term or some variable squared. Cubic, quartic, and quintic are probably a little new to you. A cubic is a 3 as our biggest or degree term. Quartic is 4. Think about a quarter being a fourth of a dollar. And then finally, quintic is 5. After that, we just name it by its degree. We would say a 6th degree polynomial, a 15th degree polynomial, whatever the degree is. Two last things to talk about. We've talked about monomial, which is one term. A binomial has 2 terms in it. So this example right here, this would be a binomial because it has 2 terms, the 2x and the -3. Bi means 2, just like a bicycle. And finally, a trinomial has 3 terms. An example besides this one would be up here, 3x squared minus 5x and plus 1. Notice it has 3 pieces to it, so it's a trinomial. Anything above trinomial is just named by the size. So if we had 4 terms or 5 terms, that would be a 4-term polynomial, a 5-term polynomial.